All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am here live with our guest, Delano Squires, who is a contributor to The Blaze. He is with the Heritage Foundation. I stumbled across him, oddly enough, on Breaking Points, one of my favorite newscasts, and they were debating affirmative action. And then I come to find out that he was a follower of Jesus. And I thought, man, it would be so dope to have him on the pod. This is going to be a dicey conversation, okay? He is a conservative. He is an immigrant. He is a marriage before carriage type of man. And so without any further ado, Delano.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate you being here, man.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. So as I said, I came across you on Breaking Points, which was super cool, super dope. And then I kind of went down a little bit of some of the stuff you do. But for folks who have no idea who you are, if you could just kind of introduce yourself. Yeah. Little backstory.
So again, my name is Delano Squires. I'm currently a research fellow for the Heritage Foundation.
Okay.
I'm in the Center for Life, Religion, and Family.
Okay.
So I do a fair amount of research and writing on issues around marriage, family, fatherhood. I'm also, as you said, a contributor to Blaze Media, mainly on Fearless with Jason Whitlock. So I've been with the show since it started in 2021, and I write a fair amount for Blaze, on average about twice a week, and also do, as I said, writing for Heritage. And I'm a husband, been married 11 years to my beautiful wife Stephanie. We have 4 kids, ages 7, 5, and then 2 3-year-olds. And so yeah, that's about it. You know, I've been writing publicly for over a decade.
Okay.
First with a site called Black and Married with Kids, which was created by a couple that wanted to provide more positive images of Black families.
Love it.
I've written for The Root, I've written for The Griot, I've written for The Federalist, and now The Blaze. So I tell people, probably the only person in the country who's had both Joy Reid and Jason Whitlock as editors.
Okay.
So I've been all over the place, all across the sort of ideological spectrum. But like where I am right now, just trying to grow where I'm planted.
Dope. And you are also an immigrant and originally from Barbados, but you grew up in the States.
Correct.
What part of the United States?
In New York.
Okay.
In New York City and Queens. So it's funny you said that because I don't typically describe myself as an immigrant, but technically I am. I was born overseas. But I mean, I was raised entirely in the States, you know, I think my parents brought me back when I was 3 months old.
Okay.
So, you know,
well,
they robbed me of the true immigrant experience. But I grew up in New York, in Queens, you know, pretty large family. And, you know, I sort of grew up in, you know, when people say it takes a village to raise a child, I was raised in that type of environment.
Got you.
So my mom is one of 10, my dad is one of 6. So we had a bunch of cousins, you know, who were already in the States. You know, there was a Black American family that would watch me sometimes, who lived next door to my aunt. And then an old Trinidadian lady who lived next door to them who would watch me. And I had a big church family, you know, growing up in church, going to church in Brooklyn. People who I'm still close to this day. So I had that sort of communal experience in terms of everyone helping to sort of raise me and my friends. My parents have been married 42 years. They made 42 years in August. So the things that I write about, I do so, particularly in terms of marriage and particularly in the context of the Black family.
Yeah.
I do so not just because of sort of the prevalence of the issues, but also personal experience and proximity as well. So
yeah, it definitely seems like folks who are immigrants, I'm an immigrant, or folks who come from immigrant families just seem built different. And
how so?
I think there's a higher expectation. And there's a higher expectation mixed with a greater appreciation for the opportunity that is America. And I feel like sometimes if you're coming from always being immersed and you don't know anything else, and like I remember as a child, like food rations in the Soviet Union. I remember we would have a tub of water and that was our allocated water amount, right? Like, those are real things. And so when you come to America, like I remember getting to America and the first place we went was a grocery store. And I had no context of it. I thought it was a toy store. It was so colorful, so many lights, the cereal aisle. And I think you grow up with not taking America for granted, I feel like, right? and that could seem very like what is it, American exceptionalism, but like they're really, to me, it seems like there's something to that in terms of work ethic. Would you say that that contributed to your worldview and how you were? Obviously, church and Jesus is involved.
Correct.
The immigrant component was that a
variable? I mean, it definitely. I think whoever you are, whatever your background, all of those things sort of contribute to who you end up being as a person. It's interesting that you say that in terms of appreciation, because I could see that on both sides. Because also, someone who grew up in New York, I never really, I don't think of New York the way a tourist would. And I think this sort of gets to your point. They come to the city, they want to hit Empire State Building, Statue of Liberty. They want to go to all these places.
Times Square.
Right. And the people who live there were like, oh, I've never been to, Ellis Island.
Right.
Because I do think, and I think this is probably like a universal trait, where the more familiar something is, the easier it is to take it for granted. And when it's not familiar, when it's new, when it's a new experience, you say, no, I want to immerse myself in that particular thing. So I definitely do think having parents, who immigrated to the States definitely didn't make a difference, because when someone leaves everything that they know, their loved ones, their family, their friends, their sort of social network, to go to another country, they don't do it just to, kick it and hang out all day, right? They're going for a purpose. And I mean, and they're, West Indians that left the Caribbean to go to England, to go to Canada, to go to the States. And many of the stories sound the same. And I do think, to your point, that there is a sort of general immigrant arc. The challenge is, once you get to that second and third generation, and the kids become Americanized, good, bad, and ugly, it's hard to maintain the same type of hunger that the first generation had. Yeah. Because the second and third generations are used to oftentimes going to bed with a full stomach, having enough food that they could throw out. Like I've seen my dad clean a plate to the point where he'll get that last rice grain between, and the fork. And I think there's something to that. Like even to this day, my mom, who's retired now, my mom will, when she comes to the house, she'll take back our water bottles, take them to the Costco in New York, and get, quarters, whatever change that they're giving her back, put it in a piggy bank for our kids, and then she'll be like, "Oh, D, here's $50 that I saved up over the last 6 months." Right? I don't even think about stuff like that. I just toss them in the recycling. So I do think it's a different mindset. But I will say this. So my wife is Black and Black American. She's a daughter of the South. She grew up in Texas. Her family sort of roots are in Louisiana, Mississippi, that type of thing. And my wife and I had no problem sort of gelling with each other's families, because even though, my parents grew up in the Caribbean, her parents grew up in the Deep South, the norms, the culture, the customs, the values were very, very much similar. Yeah. The role that the Christian faith played was the same, very similar. Large families, very much connected. Foods were different, but I love barbecue, and my wife loves oxtail, so it works itself out. So there are many things that I see in my experience, and this is one of the things that I learned as I got older, is that I would often attribute my background to, the way that I did certain things. So I said, oh, if I come into the house, I take my shoes off, and I say, oh, because West Indians take their shoes off when they get into the house. And that's often true, but so do a lot of other people. And I realized that there were common factors that sort of ran across different ethnic groups, regions, so on and so forth. That's good. So while there are some things that I do think are unique, that list at over 40 now has shrunk since I was 18. Because everything I would just say, oh, it's because I'm West Indian. Got it. So it is an interesting experience. And now, raising kids, in America, all born in this country, seeing, like, I'm experiencing that from a different perspective. So, I mean, all in all, I love it. I thank God for this country. I thank God for the opportunities that I've had, my parents have had. Hasn't always been easy,
Mm-hmm.
you know, for many of the reasons that other people would say it's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
But I realized that regardless of what country you go to, you're going to have problems.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't allow that to make me want to destroy the ground that I'm standing on.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Well, I think what you're getting at underneath is ultimately worldview
Mm-hmm.
and ideologies that impact worldviews,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so if you're talking about whether it's Armenians, whether it's Caribbeans,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a black family from the South, descendants of slaves from the
Mm-hmm.
South, whatever it is, there are certain values that are universal across time and space.
Mm-hmm.
Many of those often are influenced by faith.
Yes.
You know, even if the people themselves aren't personally seeking Jesus all
Right,
the
right,
time,
right.
there's still so much we inherit,
Right.
and we're building on top of these other foundations. Oftentimes that we don't even know what they
yeah.
are.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and I didn't realize that, especially about because I grew up like the Soviet Union was so interesting, and there's a lot of alcoholism and all these different things, right? And I didn't really understand how much Christianity influenced our culture until I got older and understood the history. And then like I went to Israel, and like Armenians have a quarter of the old town in Jerusalem till this day, right? It's like Jews, Muslims, Christians, and Armenians, right? And so you go, okay, well, we weren't practicing and reading our Bible and going to church faithfully, not back there. But there's still a framework, and there's still a view that, though it was contaminated, I would say, by communism, like there's still a foundation there. And especially with Armenians in general, I'm not sure if you've kept up with like the protests in Glendale against some of the public school stuff that they're teaching with LGBTQ Heritage Month and all that kind
Sounds
of weird
very
stuff.
much like what's going on in Maryland, with a
Maryland,
different set of immigrants who are from...
They were Muslim immigrants in Maryland,
some
right?
Muslim, some Ethiopians, Somalis, but very much similar type of deal.
Yeah, same thing. Yeah, same thing. It was interesting that both of those things happened at the same time. And so talk to me about how faith played into your journey and how a relationship with Jesus. Was that something that was kind of always there because you grew up Christian, or did you have a coming to Jesus moment as a teenager, as an adult? Like, talk to me a little bit about that.
It's actually both. So I grew up in the church, like how, you know, a lot of kids would say, you know, I grew up in the church. So going to church every Sunday, you fellowship on Friday. But if someone were to ask me, well, when did you get saved? If I was to put a date on it, it'd be September 16th, 2001. So 5 days after 9/11.
Wow.
Yeah. So I was in college. I had digital circuits or some class like that morning. I feel like that was a Tuesday morning, if my memory serves me correctly. And you know, watched some of the coverage of the attacks on TV. You know, me and my friends, we went play football just to get our minds off of it. And then, you know, when I went to church that Sunday, I walked down the aisle. You know, now again, I would say that's when I, you know, gave my life to Christ. Now, between then and now is, you know, over 20 years. And that's 20 years of God just refining me and shaping me and growing me up and exposing me to better doctrine. But yeah, that sort of foundation of faith has been part of my life ever since I can remember. And to your point, you know, I would sort of describe it as, you know, I do think there's such a thing as a Christian culture, because I think, you know, culture, often I think of culture not just about food and language and music, but norms and standards about what is right and what is wrong. So if you can have a place where nobody goes to church, but they know what the 10 Commandments are, right? So I had, I think, a good foundation. I had the type of parents who believed in training up a child in the way that they should go, so that when they get old, they won't depart from it.
Yeah.
And I had a ton of people who poured into me, and especially like the men in our church, my best friends' fathers, my dad, who poured into us as young boys. And we were all rebellious and we didn't want to listen, but they would take us and they were discipling us. And I think that seed yielded good fruit in due time. So it's always been a part of my life. But one thing I'll say is this: I didn't grow up hearing the term biblical worldview or Christian worldview, so I didn't know what it was, and I did not have a Christian worldview, even for much of my adulthood. The way I would explain it is this: if my life was a house, I thought I owned it, and religion was one room in the house.
That's good.
And every Sunday, I would let Jesus come out, have his run of the place from 9:30 to about 11:45. And then when we left service, whether we went home and made breakfast or we went to brunch, I'd politely ask him to go back in until, the following week.
Yeah.
And then I started to be exposed to better doctrine. I started to mature as a believer. And I started to hear people, the Vodi Bakums and people like that who talk about biblical worldview, and they explain it in such a way that I got it. And now if I was to explain it, I was like, no, God owns the house, everything in it. He built it. His presence can be felt throughout every room. It's entirely, his essence and everything about what's in that house ultimately points to him and gives him glory.
Yeah.
So now when I think about politics and finances and relationships and life and marriage, all of it, I say, okay, what does the scripture have to say about this?
Yeah.
And that was a process that took years. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'll tell myself in 2012, when President Obama was up for re-election, and I was married, newly married. We were living in Maryland. The state of Maryland had a same-sex marriage referendum on the ballot. And I voted in favor of it.
Oh, wow.
Because to me, the way I reason is like, oh, well, if a man and a woman can get married, who am I to say, or who was the government to say that two men couldn't get married? Now, I was going to church at the time. And I would identify as a Christian at the time. Oh,
you're good.
Okay. And I would identify as a Christian at the time. But again, I didn't, the notion of a worldview, like I didn't connect the dots as a related I didn't connect the dots between my faith and my politics.
Would you say you were more libertarian then or more liberal?
I didn't even have.
You didn't even have
I didn't even have a label for it.
Got you.
It's just what I thought. Right. It was just a bunch of different thoughts together. You want to
know something interesting? Not to derail you. In 2008, California had requiring parental consent for the deletion of babies and same-sex marriage on the ballot. They voted against same-sex marriage.
Wow.
And allowed termination of babies for minors without parental consent.
Wow. Yeah.
That's how different things were.
Right.
Like, and I'm sitting there looking
that was Prop 208, the same-sex marriage one,
I think something like that. Because I remember it was a controversy because Rick Warren was pushing it and was, but I was just like, this is so weird. Like, you would think that the same people that be against same-sex marriage would be like, 15-year-olds shouldn't be able to terminate babies without their parents' consent. But that was the way the state voted back then.
Yeah.
Which is crazy how much has changed in just, 15, 16 years.
It's a completely different world.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So you voted in favor of it.
Correct.
But you didn't really have the language. And what were you doing for work back then? Like, what was?
I worked in local government. I worked in DC government.
Oh, okay.
So I was
joking with you earlier. I said you wanted them Richmond, north of Richmond.
right. So it's local government. Very much community facing in the neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Providing services and resources to low income families, like tech resources, basically helping people get online. We were trying to bridge the digital divide.
In terms of the digital divide, because you guys saw digital as opportunity for education, opportunity for resources.
Correct. So at the time the program started, about 40% of homes in DC did not have a home internet connection.
Wow.
So we did training programs for low-income adults, seniors, ex-offenders, K through 12 students, had a mobile tech lab. We took around to like public housing communities. We fixed devices for free in the neighborhoods. So that's what I was doing in 2012. But again, even if I was looking back on it now, I wouldn't have called myself a libertarian. I didn't have any cohesive worldview.
Got you.
it was all vibes and feels at the time.
Interesting.
So I couldn't. It was like baseline logic. And this is where worldview comes in, because I was thinking, well, again, if a man and a woman can get married, then why can't two men? What's the difference? Now I understand the difference biblically.
Yeah.
But at the time, I didn't think of it that way, and I was the type of person who would have said, well, I don't want to impose my religion on somebody else. That was the way I was thinking in 2012.
Got you.
So again,
yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've had a similar journey where I've ebbed and flowed. In 2005, 2005, I was taking a communication class, and we had to do a series of speeches, and the last one was a persuasive speech. And in 2005, my persuasive speech was why homosexual marriage shouldn't be allowed. Like,
should not be allowed.
Shouldn't be legalized.
Should not be legal. Okay.
Yeah. And I had a handful of people in that class very upset. And I didn't bring God into it. I just went over here are the rates of this, here are the rates of that. This is why, And then as I kind of got older, I probably went a bit more liberal than libertarian, and then kind of came full circle back to conservative.
Okay.
You know? And so it's interesting how those things can kind of flow. But I do think it goes back to, like you said, a coherent worldview.
Right.
You know, like once you stumble across a coherent world, because you can't be libertarian on certain things. You just can't, you know?
Yeah.
There are certain things where I'm probably more libertarian on now.
Right.
But after having kids, things just change.
Absolutely.
Man. You know, things just change. And so it's hard. It just becomes more complicated, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I have some libertarian friends. I get what they're after, right?
Yeah.
And there are many areas in which I think small government would be a good thing. But if your only guiding principle is sort of like the non-aggression principle or whatever,
yeah,
then what is the libertarian argument, for example, against legalized transition for adults, right? Why can't an adult do that? What's the libertarian argument for expanding the definition of marriage to be more than two people, or more than two people, or one person and a different species, like an animal?
Sure.
You know, if so, I understand, you know, what many libertarians are after, but if you have nothing holding the center and no boundaries on the edges, eventually you're just going to spin off into the abyss. And I'm all for liberty and freedom, but those things have to be tethered to something.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you process it? So this is how I've always looked at, and we don't have to go over specific issues, but I've always looked at it from the lens of 1 Corinthians 5, where Paul's writing this church. There's debauchery happening. In 1 Corinthians 3, he's calling them worldly. 1 Corinthians 5, he drops this bombshell. You guys are sexually immoral, not even in the way the pagans tolerate.
Oh, yeah.
Dude's taking his stepmom.
Right.
Or so we hope that was his stepmom. Right. His father's wife.
Right.
And then he goes on to basically say, hey, I told you not to associate with sexually immoral people. I wasn't talking about the people in the world.
Right.
I was talking about the people in the church.
Right.
Expel the wicked from among you.
Right.
But when it comes to the world, God is going to judge the world. You judge those in the church, right? And so obviously that's written in the context of a local church community. But I've kind of extended that to some parts of like, man, I have not cared what people do in the privacy of their own home. I don't care if someone's unregenerated and not a Christian and not born again, and they're sleeping with their girlfriend. I could tell you what the data says about that, and that's a bad decision. If somebody's going to choose same-sex relationships, I can tell you what the data says and how it's not in their self-interest. If you're of age and want to dress up as the opposite sex, I can tell you what the data, right? I
got you.
But I don't care what you're doing in your own home.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like the libertarian position, I guess, that I've held on those issues. But again, I think where it crosses the line is now you are saying I have to affirm and my kids have to affirm that it's the same as a nuclear family.
Yeah.
And it's not. And we're not going to pretend that it is. And then I'm like, well, gosh, now I feel like I'm being pushed into the corner of being far right or conservative, right? And so I guess do you think foundationally that libertarian position doesn't work because there's no neutrality, and so eventually it's going to get shoved in your face? There's two religions happening.
Right.
One is going to succeed.
Right. I mean, there's no such thing as a morally neutral public square.
Absolutely.
Right. And one of the things, and I say it like this, one of the first op-eds I wrote when I was at Heritage was entitled "Drag Queen Conservatism is the Real Threat to Religious Liberty."
Okay.
And it was actually in response to something that David French had said after the National Conservatism Conference, which was robustly religious, organized, by a man who is an Orthodox Jew, I believe, Yoram Hazony. Al Mohler was there. He spoke the last night. A bunch of people talked about faith as it relates to public policy. And David French basically said, these people, and I don't know if he used the term Christian nationalist, but he was moving in that direction. Sure. These people are going to be a threat to religious liberty. And my position in my piece is like, no, drag queen conservatives, right? The people who will put on the same level a pastor wanting to read to kids in the library and grown men dressed up as caricatures, of women wanting to read to kids, not just in the library, but in the school where it's compulsory. He'll put those two things on the same moral level. And I don't. And the reason is because every society has both a public culture and a closet, quote unquote. And the closet represents the range of beliefs and behaviors, and values and expressions that are voluntarily relegated or relegated to the private sphere. So to your point, there's certain things that people do in privacy of their own home, and 99% of it we would never know because they do it in the privacy of their own home. And for decades, particularly in this country, religious people, particularly let's say Christians in this instance, could live out loud and proud. You could say God bless you. You could say Merry Christmas. You could say, you can pray. I didn't grow up where prayer was in schools, but I know people who did. And all manner of sexual activity, particularly non-normative sexual activity, was relegated to the private sphere. But now those two things have switched. And all the sex stuff is in public. Yeah. And now religious people have to cower in their prayer closet practicing personal pronouns because we are now afraid to say, no, I think only women can get pregnant. That's considered hate speech. So that to me just shows that there is a battle and has always been a battle for the truth. And that plays out in the public square. So I think the libertarian position assumes that neutrality is possible. And I would argue that that's not the case. So someone's worldview is always going to influence public policy, is going to influence law, is going to influence social norms and cultural customs. So I just would rather it be a Christian worldview and perspective.
And that's fair. And I think that's where I wouldn't have an issue with folks that fall in the Christian nationalist side, right? Which whatever that even means now, right? Like what
capital
does it mean?
C, little n.
Yeah, like what are we saying there? So I hear that, but I guess then my next question, follow-up question would be like, okay, so then do we make fornication illegal? Do we make adultery illegal? Do we, right? Because there's certain things that like are obviously net negatives to society, but people are still allowed to do them.
Oh yeah,
And so, because when I'm reading 1 Corinthians, they're clearly living in an environment that's hostile to Christians,
right?
And that is pagan in worldview, and they're told like, you make sure that you're set apart. What the world does is what the world does,
right?
And I guess that would even go back to like how Christian is America as a nation, right? That we can get into a deeper conversation. Are there Christian principles, or was it a Christian nation, or was it kind of a mix of both, or was it a completely pluralistic nation where everybody can come with all worldviews, right? How do you navigate that? Specifically fornication, adultery, being drunk, right? Which we would say being drunk is a sin,
right?
And then by extension, then you get into homosexuality and you get into all these other things, which again, we don't do any of those things. And I would rebuke anybody in my personal life who was a Christian in participating in any of those things, right? But in terms of what non-Christians do, how would you navigate? And by the way, I am agreeing with you that there's no such thing as neutrality.
Yeah. And I think that's a great question. I don't necessarily have all the answers. I will say this, generally speaking. Every society has to navigate, the types of things that they will tolerate as expressed through their laws and their social customs, right?
Okay.
The law is a teacher. It just depends on what it is that the society wants to learn. So, for instance, like when Uganda passed, a law recently around aggravated homosexuality, and even conservative Senator Ted Cruz had something to say, this is a human rights violation. And my thing is this, and I understand the sentiment, and part of it is because we've been so acculturated that we see any challenge to sometimes what I'll call the Rainbow Revolution as a act of hate. But the truth of the matter is, there are places. Well, I'm not sure if polygamy. Well, polygamy is illegal.
Yeah,
in America.
Yeah,
right?
for the most part. There's like some loopholes
Yeah.
and stuff like that, but yeah, it's illegal.
So, and I only bring that up to say that every culture and country has lines. It's just a matter of where you want to draw them,
That's good.
right? So it's illegal here, but it may be legal in Uganda. And we would laugh at the Ugandans if they said, "Oh, look how backward the Americans are. They don't allow a man to have more than one wife." How libertarian is that? If the man can afford more than one wife, and the two women would prefer to share one husband than for neither to have any husband, why wouldn't Americans allow them to do that? So my thing is, every culture has to.
Are you advocating polygamy now? It's
No.
It's very red pillish of you. Get Andrew Tate on the phone.
No. But I mean, that's my point.
I see the thought experiment.
Yeah,
I get
yeah.
you. I got you.
So it's like everybody has to regulate in some way.
Yeah.
Now, to your point, I'm not saying every sin has to be a crime, right? And every crime doesn't have to come with the ultimate punishment. But our laws, one, are always moral. Every law is moral because it expresses somebody's view of right or wrong. If you think a 71% marginal tax rate is what should happen and what should be done, then that's an expression of your views of, the state and the public fisc, right? Public resources. So, and I know there was a time when adultery was illegal, and you could probably get some sort of compensation if a woman or man broke up your happy home. Would I be opposed to a community saying, we believe so much in marriage that we elect people who reflect our values, and one of their priorities is to, let's say this could happen, one, repeal no-fault divorce, and two, make adultery a crime that's punished by some type of civil action. So if you are a woman and you insert yourself into some married couple's marriage, or a man who does the same, they can come back and sue you for $15,000. I wouldn't have any problem if a culture if a county or a municipality wanted to do something like that.
Yeah. I think, you know what it is, man, if I'm honest with you, I think oftentimes whatever our permanent view of things, like whatever the present is, tends to feel very permanent, right? So when you present an idea like that, I go, that actually makes sense. Like I'm not opposed to that, right? But you think like, well, but we're so here,
right?
Like it's so
how would we
here.
even get there?
How do we even get there?
Right.
We're so here. So I get it, and again, that's why I feel like in my own journey, like I've definitely felt more and more as someone that was centrist. Right, I voted all across the political spectrum. Within the last several years, I'd say the last 3 years, I've definitely felt more pushed to the right.
Right.
And I'm like, wait a minute, no. Like this ain't, this ain't that. But it's like everything else has shifted, and so yeah, I hear you. No, I think that's good. So you're saying like there are certain things that could be up for reconsideration that are moral issues.
Oh, absolutely. And my thing is this.
Fornication too? Would you put fornication there?
I mean, I think that would be a lot harder to adjudicate.
Yeah.
Right?
Like I would be with like corn being completely outlawed. Like I think that's, I'm speaking in code because the video is going to get taken down.
I got you. So I would agree with you there.
I'm against high fructose corn syrup.
I got you. So yeah, I would agree with you there. And I'll admit, and this is just, and this admission is a reflection both of my fallen nature,
Yeah.
and how far the culture has shifted. Right,
Yeah.
there's certain things that if they were made illegal, I would recoil and be, oh my gosh, we're imposing on people's civil rights and civil liberties. And I will say, particularly when it comes to anything having to do with sexual orientation or gender identity, the single biggest victory from my perspective for the LGBTQIA2S plus community is not Obergefell. It's not same-sex adoption. It's not that. It is the complete normalization of homosexuality and now transgenderism throughout every part of American culture. To the point where even as a Christian, if you're watching a TV program and it has married couples, there's something in your mind that's saying, okay, when is the same-sex couple coming up?
Bro, me and my wife were watching a show this week. I'm not going to tell you what the show is. I'll tell you after the show.
Okay.
Watching a show, and there's two different lesbian couples in the show, right? And then there's another gay male character in the show, and then the lead character has a friend, and the way the friend touches his shoulder and goes, "It's gonna be all right. I'm here for you," something like that. I said, "Babe, if they add another gay character to this, I can't
Way
do
over quota.
I cannot do a fourth. We're going for a fourth.
Way over
we got
quota.
3, bro.
Yeah.
You gonna add a fourth? I was like, come on.
Yeah.
You know, like it didn't add to the story.
No.
It wasn't interesting.
No.
And it was just like, oh man. But it goes back to the whole like DEI, not the DEI. What is the what's the score they're giving out? The ESG score, and now certain movies and shows can't get nominated for certain awards unless they have X amount of. Right. You know, it's weird.
And this is representation run amok, right? Yeah. It's but again, even in a show where there's one gay character or now one trans character, I mean, we survive, I don't know, 100 years without seeing someone who says that they're male who now believes that they're female. So again, that the biggest win is what has been normalized and has been baked into our culture to such an extent that, everyone feels it.
Sure.
And not just adults.
Sure.
Because again, we both have, young kids. Anything that's made after like 2017, my wife and I, we vet thoroughly before we allow our kids to watch it. So the kids they've been on watching like DuckTales from like 1989, because I'm like, that's fairly safe. I let them watch Thundercats. I let them watch Batman animated series. Sure. But anything that's made after a certain point.
No, that's true.
Because the content creators, the Disneys and the Netflixes, they inject this. Now they don't do it because they're more feline than canine. They don't do it straight up with like 2 men or 2 women. They'll use animal characters. They'll use amorphous characters, 2 blobs. They'll use dinosaurs. Because what they're trying to do, and I know a lot of people don't like the term grooming, and I use a slightly different term. They're trying to tenderize our kids. Because, and the way I would explain, the metaphor is this: you can tenderize with brute force. Get the steak, nice ribeye from the store, still cold. Unwrap it, slap it on the table, on the cutting board, and you get your mallet out and you hammer it, bang, 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 bang. That's force. That's policy. That's law. You must use my personal pronouns or face fine, cancellation, whatever, criminal charge. But when you put it in a marinade, it's got the aroma, it's got the smells.
Yeah.
But the steak is in there. It's like, oh, this is a pretty nice, this is cool surround. I'm not getting hit over my head. But those fibers are being loosened and pulled apart until it's ready to go onto the grill. Yeah. And I think that's what they use for the kids. They want kids to see these issues in a different light and say, oh, wow. They want my 3-year-old to think the way I did 10 years ago. Oh, well, a man and a woman. Oh, marriage is not just between a man and a woman. It could be between any 2 people or 3 people or 4 people. And that's the part of it, to your point, like, once you become a parent, the stakes are raised. Yep. And particularly as a man, if that doesn't get your back up off the couch, I'm not sure what will.
Yeah. I want to show you something and see what you think about it. So there's a study that came out that has shown that since 2022, have you seen this?
I might have. It looks like Gallup.
Yeah, so it's on the screen, right?
Okay.
And so you name these are how Americans today, and this is a fairly big study, so this isn't like a small sample group, but yeah, it's Gallup. Americans' opinions on moral issues, 2022 versus 2023. So birth control, it took a 4-point dip, right? So 2022, 92% thought it was cool. All of a sudden, 88%. Divorce took a 3-point dip. Sex between an unmarried man and an unmarried woman took a 4-point dip. So now only 72% people think fornication is okay, right? Having a baby outside of marriage stayed the same, which is sad.
Yeah.
I don't know how. I mean, just the economics of that is crazy. Gambling took a 2-point dip, but check this out. LGTV relationships, 7-point dip. That's in a year, right? We keep going. The death penalty increased by 5 points, right?
That makes sense.
Doctor-assisted self-deletion went down by 2 points. Medical testing on animals, that would make sense to me. Sex between teenagers went down 3%.
Okay.
So I think like there's a lot of things trending in the right direction. Corn went down by 2%. Cloning animals went down by 4%. Suicide went down by 2%. I shouldn't have said that word. Married men and women having adultery went up by 3%.
Interesting.
I don't know how that went up, right? And so this to me, and you tell me what you think about this, but I think this is America as a nation trending in the right direction on these moral issues. On some of these moral issues, obviously not all of them.
I mean, can you go back to the gay or lesbian relation one? Because I wanted to see what the number was.
71% in
2022
used to think that it was okay. So 7 out of 10 people. And now it's closer to 6 out of 10 people.
I guess you could say it's trending in the right direction. I mean
that's the biggest. That's the biggest one.
That is true, and
that's the biggest one.
That may surprise some people. It doesn't surprise me because, I mean, I think one of the laws of physics is like, for every reaction there's an equal and counter.
Yeah.
Counter reaction or whatever. So for every action there's a reaction.
Yeah.
And I think the pendulum is starting to swing a little bit more back to the middle because parents, particularly parents, have seen, and this is sort of where we were talking about what people do behind closed doors. It's not even, parents see kids at pride parades, which they do. It's not just they see the content on Disney and Netflix, which they do. But now it's their kids are being forced to endure this in school.
That's right.
Like we were talking about, you were talking about Glendale, I was talking about, Montgomery County in Maryland. The Montgomery County stuff with the parents is not, we're against LGBT people. It's the parents want the ability to opt out of having their kids in these classes.
Same thing in Glendale.
And the government is like, no, you can't opt out.
Yeah.
You're forced to. So if you want to talk about,
I ended up looking up the memo from the school district, and that's exactly what it was. Is they could opt out of the sex ed,
right?
But they couldn't opt out of the civics and the history,
right?
And that's all the parents want.
And a lot of parents, and it's just like, so you're forcing my kid to do this, and so this is not that the LGBT community needs any consulting advice. But if you want to ruin your reputation and sense of goodwill, and I'm speaking from their perspective, with a culture, you would keep doing what they're doing right now.
Yeah. Well, I think to your point, I think you're totally right. And I think what's happening is they hitched their wagon to the wrong issue. So like, if we're talking about the Democratic Party, if we're talking about that community, it's like, there were actual issues that were more sensible and feasible, and then but that became the issue,
right? And
then I think the rest of the country is like, wait a minute, like what are we doing now?
Yeah, but I mean, this is the thing. These are called movements for a reason, right? Because they never stop. I can't think of a single issue that has to do with sex, sexuality, or gender identity over the last 20 years, so a generation. Where particularly the progressive left has said, we want to go this far on this particular issue and not a step further. They're always moving. So the conservatives who said Obergefell same-sex marriage is going to lead to other things, who were laughed at, have now been proven right. Now, I don't think anybody anticipated that the fight for the schoolhouse would have been driving drag queens and, you know, adults who want to talk about their sexual preferences out of the classroom. But that's exactly where we are right now. So I think, you know, parents have to be aware of the culture as it exists, and particularly Christian families.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to education, right? Like education to me is equal part scholarship and discipleship. It's academic mastery and it's moral formation.
Good.
And for generations, our parents felt comfortable saying, I'll send you to the local public school. And I'm confident you'll come back, you know, a better person.
Yeah. Yeah.
But now that's oftentimes not the case for all different types of reasons.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I'm in Vista, California, and there's 2 elementary schools that are shutting down this year. This is their last year because less and less parents are sending them to it, right? And then, but charter schools are up. Private schools are up. Homeschool co-ops are up. And is it the market just kind of doing what the market does, you know, to an extent? It sucks because I know there are parents that maybe don't have the same resources and access that we do that aren't going to have the same ability to drive their kids to the charter school.
Right.
You know what I mean? So like, I'm like, that sucks. Like I want all kids to have a good education, you know?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, like y'all been doing some goofy stuff. You know?
And now parents are letting their voice be heard. Like this is democracy in action.
Right.
The people are deciding.
Right.
Now, because we started homeschooling 2020. Our oldest, who is 7 now, she was 3. DC, we lived in DC at the time. DC starts pre-K at 3 years old. It's basically like daycare relief for working parents, right? Had her in a good school. You know, she knew her numbers and the shapes and the colors, all that basic stuff. But they sent home homework every day. They had to practice her handwriting every day. And we were generally satisfied with the school, right? Quick point. So given where our neighborhood was, this school was 96% black. It's no problem for me. But I think about sort of the racial justice people who will see a school with those demographics and say, oh, this school is segregated. This is why the NAACP wanted to have a moratorium on charter schools a couple of years ago. Because to them, for all that, you know, race talk, anything that's all black, they see as a negative. Now, what they don't explain is why, for instance, let's say Lincoln High School, if Lincoln High School is 96% black, why that's segregated, and there should be laws to address that. But Lincoln University and HBCU, with the same demographics, is a culturally enriching education environment. That being said, we were satisfied with the school. Then came late January 2020, this is before COVID, and the school had a big like display. It's on a chalkboard with images of like Mike Brown and Trayvon Martin, and it was like a BLM display. And I emailed the principal and I said, I just wanted to know, you know, what's your take on Black Lives Matter? And didn't get a response. And I emailed again in February, didn't get a response. I told my wife she's not going back there. So we started looking for a classical Christian school. We ended up visiting one in Maryland, which we liked a lot. But you know, after our 3rd child was born, we ran the numbers and we were like, you know what, maybe we should consider homeschooling. So that's what we've been doing now, and we love it. And to your point, and my wife left her job, so she came home. So this, you know, she's the headmistress of Squires, you know, Academic Academy or whatever. But really, it was much more about particularly my spiritual growth and development than the resource issue.
Interesting.
Because one, I didn't know anybody was homeschooled. My mom worked outside the home. All my friends' moms worked outside the home. But they would, you know, very much dedicated to their husbands and their children and their household. So that was never an issue, because this is like pre-BlackBerry. So when you left the job, you left it for the day. People weren't calling and texting and emailing you all hours of the night. But for me, when my wife first floated the idea of coming home, I had been so acculturated in a feminist culture society that I said, no, girl, man, you're making good money. You know? I thought of her not as a nurturer, right? and educator and discipler of our children, I thought of her primarily as a wage earner.
Whoa.
Right? Of course, my wife, and I love her.
Yeah.
But the prospect of losing out on her income made me say, "Oh, I don't know about this."
Wow,
so
man.
I had to mature
Yeah.
as a man, as a Christian man, to say, no, your wife brings a lot more
Come on.
to the table than just her ability to earn.
Yeah.
And after a while, as we we matured and we moved down the process, I look back on it and I'm just like, I'm a totally different person than my grandfather was.
Mm-hmm.
A man growing up in the 50s. First of all, he got married way earlier. I got married. I was 30. You know, my parents got married. My dad was like 23, 24. My mom was like 20, 21. And the median age at first marriage, even from 1980, has gone from about 23 for a man, 21 for a woman, to about 31 for a man and 29 for a woman. But a guy my grandfather's age, if he met a woman, she said, "Look, I'm gonna turn your house into a home. I'm gonna take care of you and our children and so on and so forth." He said, "I struck gold." But the guys in my generation, particularly guys younger than me, sometimes I watch relationship podcasts and they'll ask this woman, it's a silly question, I don't like the question, what do you bring to the table? And the woman will say something similar to what I said just now. And the guys will say, I could pay somebody to cook meals. I could pay somebody to clean my house. And I think to myself, these guys have completely lost their minds.
Yeah.
So
it's that red pill brain rot.
Yes. Yeah. So I had to mature spiritually.
Yeah.
And listening on the stay at home piece, and then on the home education piece, listening to Vodi Bakham's, Children of Caesar, when he talked about, if you're a Christian and you send your kids to the government, to Caesar, to be educated, you shouldn't be surprised when they come home acting like Romans.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, oh, I got it now.
Yeah.
I got it. So
that's so funny, man. We came to a similar conclusion, but through a totally different door, where we went through a debt-free journey. We had $100,000 in debt.
Wow.
We got married young, 23, 21. And I was more so like, initially I was like, yeah, babe, you work. Like, when we have kids, I'll be the stay-at-home dad, who's trying to start my business on the side. I was cool with it. And then we went and we discovered Dave Ramsey, and we ended up, so we had $100,000, over $100,000 in debt. We ended up paying about $45,000. There's a second mortgage I had in the midst of the whole crash of the housing thing. I settled on that. Anyway, long story short, we paid off $45,000 in 18 months. Then we had an emergency fund of 6 months. Then I quit my job, and my wife was a stay-at-home mom when I quit my job, the one who encouraged me to quit my job. And so we knew that like our values were like, why am I going to have a kid and send them off to pay somebody else to raise my kid? Like that just didn't make sense. And then we started looking into families and what their net income was based on 2 workers versus 1 worker. And some of the studies show that families who have one sole provider will end up netting home, taking home more than families with 2 workers. Yeah. And I was like, because when you factor in gas, when you factor in dry cleaning, when you factor in eating out, all the other stuff.
And childcare,
it's almost a wash, and especially if you have more than 1 kid.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
And so that's how we came to that conclusion. And so I've always been like, babe, like you offer so much more than whatever you can go earn on the market.
Absolutely.
And the stuff, and she's able to work with us now. So she works from home and she homeschools the kids. And so I'm on some like, hey, like whatever you need to make your thing easier. Like if you want a lady to come in and help, she won't do nothing.
Yeah.
She won't. We get meal. You saw the meal prep we had. She won't do meal prep. She won't do Blue Apron. She won't let no one come in and clean.
I feel you.
I was like, okay. I was like, okay, laundry. Let's just hire a company to come do all the laundry. Nope, she won't do laundry.
She's not gonna let him clean the house. She definitely not gonna let him touch your clothes.
It's crazy.
I already know that one. I don't know your wife.
Crazy.
I know that one. Yeah.
And so I'm with you, man. And I think that's a gem from Vadi. Okay, so tell me, you are a Black conservative, right?
You can put it that way.
Which I think is an interesting place, right? Because when I hear you talk about it, when I've heard you talk about it, and I've only saw you on the affirmative action debate,
Yeah.
you're also not one to deny that there are systemic issues that have created some degrue of inequality. Now, how we define that word systemic is probably going to be
and inequality,
for
right?
That
matter, yeah.
Cosmic justice versus what is it? Cosmic justice versus
I forgot. I know how
you know where I'm
Thomas
going with
Sowell.
that.
I got it.
Right. And so you've also not denied that policies from a generation ago impact people today, right? So we're talking like redlining, we're talking about those things. So in all of that, this is what I see. You tell me what you think. I feel like the Democratic Party initially, the liberals initially hitched their wagon behind the BLM thing, right? That turned out to be a scam, right?
You about to start talking BLM? Let me hydrate.
That turned out to be a scam. The organization,
big time.
Though I do think that there were some decent reforms in terms of body cameras, in terms of stuff like that, that I think made things hopefully safer for everybody in terms of interaction with police, which I think needed to be happening. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the case of Art Arzuta, guy in Compton PD, blew the whistle on a gang within the police department and ended up just getting ran out of the department because of gangs within the department, right? So it's not like these things don't exist. They're definitely are. So I feel like there was some progress that happened with that. And then liberals, Democratic Party, progressive, whatever you want to call them, then they hitched their wagon behind the trans stuff, which I think you just lost the country on that, right? The organization, completely off the rails, right? Just mismanagement of funds. Here's the flip side to all of that, is that I think that on the conservative end, there seems to be minimal acknowledgement of policies, unless they're democratic policies, of course. Like policies unless it's the welfare state, they will not acknowledge anything, right?
I got you.
And to the point I believe Larry Elder produced a movie.
Uncle Tom and Uncle Tom too.
In the first one, where they do this whole thing of and then they end up going, yeah, but the Republicans don't really want to speak to our community. They don't really want outreach to our community.
Yeah.
And this is going to sound, I'm going to throw another eyeball off of you.
Okay.
And it seems like the only guy that did do any sort of reasonable outreach was Trump, which is because Trump's the quote unquote racist guy, right?
Yeah.
And so it's so convoluted and confusing, right? But if we're talking about, and I was just with D1, right? And you know, I sat down with folks that maybe are a bit more liberal. And if we talk about like, hey, I don't know what percentage of our lives and how they play out is our zip code versus our choices, is our family versus the school and the discipleship you get, is your environment versus your imagination. I don't know what percent. I don't know if it's 50-50. I don't know if it's 80-20. I don't know what those percentages. But from a prescription aspect, anyone that tells me I have to change the entire system and that's their advice, like in the red pill space, it's like we got to overturn. You can't be happy until no fault divorce laws get overturned.
Right,
you can't get married to. Right? It's no. You can make good decisions. You can marry the right person. You can build a family. You can change. You can get all those things. And so in the same thing, like I'm always going to lean more to conservative values. I'm always going to lean to the things we can control.
Correct.
I don't know how much of things are influenced by external factors.
Right.
Zip code, public school.
Right.
How much of fatherlessness is because of bad democratic policy? How much of it is because of the war on drugs? How much of it is because of the crime? I don't know those percentages, right? But I do know that the policy that's the values that seem most aligned with mine don't always do a great degree of outreach of platforming brothers like you. Instead, and I'm not to say this is a diss, but instead they platform a Candace Owens.
I got you.
Right? Who will get up there and read George Floyd's rap sheet and how evil of a man he was instead of dealing with the particulars of what happened. Right. And so like help me understand that. And folks that listen, most black folks are going to be more conservative leaning in their personal values, at least from my experience. You would disagree. Wow, that's crazy. In terms of church influence, right? Or at least my audience.
Fair. Maybe your audience.
Yeah.
But if you were asking me that question, particularly for anybody under the age of 35, I don't know about that one.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Yeah.
When I say conservative values, I'm talking most black folks I know are pro God, they're pro 2A, right? They're pro family, they're pro entrepreneurship. Yeah. Even folks that would get dismissed as like woke,
I got you,
quote unquote woke.
I got you.
in the Christian rap space.
Right.
They're all pro 2A.
Yeah.
They're all entrepreneurs. They're all getting to the bag.
Yeah, I got you.
And they're all pro family.
Yeah.
And even if they
True.
were to say systemic racism is an issue we need to deal with, they still would hold to all those values. You know what I mean?
Agreed.
So anyway, what do you make sense of all that? I know I just opened up a can of worms, but I'm asking you this not as like I'm trying to corner you, because I genuinely agree with your views in terms of what I heard you express before. So what do you make of all of that?
So let me, I'm going to say this, and this should come as no surprise, but I'm going to say it because I think it's particularly important on this issue. When Christians speak about what I call sort of the Genesis agenda, sex, marriage, family, those things that God defines, those things that do not belong to Caesar, we tend to land in the same place, largely because we are going back to the scripture. Issues of race are more complicated because there aren't any sort of clear verses in the way that Genesis 1:27 says, God created male and female in his own image, right?
Yep.
But what I tend to find is that, particularly in the Christian space, and I may flip-flop between race generally and then particularly what I see within the Christian circle.
Sure.
But within a Christian space, I think one of the biggest problems with how we talk about race is that the first move many people make is to lay down their sword, is to put down their Bible. Now, again, I'm not saying you're going to look to First Lamentations, and see, something about the black man in America. I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
But there's certain principles that we abandon, right? We
engage. Can you give me an example
Sure.
of what principle would you say gets abandoned when the conversation comes up?
A big one is partiality. And even though weights and measures, God was actually literally talking about weights and measures, we don't weigh things the same. I'll give you the clearest example. I talked about working in DC government, right? My last year was in the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. I was a resident liaison. I would talk to people who've had bullets come through their window and, lost kids and all sorts of crazy stuff. And I'm familiar with it. I grew up in New York. I've lived in DC or in the DC area for 15 years. I went to school in Pittsburgh. I've always lived in and around cities. My wife's from Houston. I'm a city guy through and through. And I follow particularly issues of public safety, crime, violence, because, just in my environment, right? And that's a lot of cousins that live in Brooklyn and all this other stuff. And 90+% of the victims and perpetrators in DC were young black men. It's not particularly surprising. So if there is a pastor in DC who uses his public platforms, let's say social media platforms, and he bangs the table when a bunch of kids from Eastern Kentucky show up on the National Mall and they got their red MAGA hats on, and a Native American guy's banging a drum in their face, and one of them smirks,
yeah.
And that's a national controversy within even Reform evangelicalism. And their kids dying in your city every day. Now, I'm not saying you have to turn into, the local crime blotter. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. But if the only time you say Black Lives Matter is when a black life is taken by white hands, then really what you mean is white perpetrators matter. Because for every George Floyd and Jacob Blake, and again, you could get into the specifics of the cases or Michael Brown.
Sure.
I can name you 5 to 6 school-aged children from across the country who've been cut down by violence. Just off the top of my head. Just because it's stuff that I follow. Because I actually care about it. So when I say partiality, it's like, oh, no, these things only matter when we can attribute this particular crime to systemic racism and white supremacy. That is when we get out the bullhorn. Now, when we can't do that, then we'll say, oh, this is a resource deprivation issue. And when I say Christians lay down their Bible, many of them will not say this, but many believers, black and white, even some who may consider themselves sort of right-leaning conservative, take a materialist perspective when crime is perpetrated by black people and hold to a moral perspective when it's perpetrated by white people.
Interesting.
Right? I've never heard someone say or suggest or even ask, well, I wonder what kind of school Dylan Roof came from. Was his school adequately funded? Did his recreation center stay open till 11 p.m. instead of 9 p.m.? Right? What kind of job opportunities were there? They don't ever do that. Because they don't say this, but I pick it up because I can, I can interpret these things. I can divine these things. The unspoken truth for even a lot of believers when it comes to race is that Black people are largely influenced by systems, structures, environments, resources, or the lack thereof. So when a crime happens, it's, until we fix the housing system and public education system, well, what can you expect? But again, when a white kid or a man commits a heinous act of violence, no one goes there. So to them, the white man has agency and the Black man does not. Right? To them, and they would never say this because they're race people, but to them, the way they speak and think, they treat Black folk like melanated vessels of chaos, pushed to and fro by historic oppression and contemporary and present discrimination. And I resent that. Honest. And one of the hardest things. Yeah.
I could tell.
And one of the hardest things for me to do is to respond to that in a winsome fashion. Like, I hate it because I understand how demeaning it is. Because one of the few things that separates a boy from a man is his ability to take responsibility. And what they constantly say, and when they say, and I try not to mock it too much on social media, but I'm very tempted. Oh, white people, we have to use our voice to speak up for the. I'm just like, who are you? You live in Idaho. I live in New York City. I live in Philadelphia. Why would a Black pastor have to go to somebody who lives 16 states over to get them to use their voice to advocate for people in his community? Yeah. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, it's almost projecting, because then when the white supremacy trope gets put out there, which is on everything, right? Like Christianity is white supremacy, punctuality is white supremacy,
nuclear
family, 2
timeliness, objectivity.
Then they say 2 + 2 equals 4 is white supremacy. I think in Canada they had that. But that is literally like when you're removing people's agency from them, and you need white allies to speak on Black issues. That sounds backwards.
It is, and one of the things, and I see this whenever, particularly on race issues, is that where we are today is not where we've always been. When I read Frederick Douglass, and he's obviously famed abolitionist, and he's speaking to people who are sympathetic to his cause, and they were asking him, what should we do with the Negro once emancipated? And he said, do nothing with us. I'm paraphrasing, but he said, if the apples won't stay on the tree of their own accord, let them fall. Right? I'm basically just asking you to let me be and live the type of life that you live for yourself. And that's one of the things, like, I hate paternalism. And I don't care how much you try to dress it up as social justice, I'm not buying it. And as I said, and you asked about BLM, and I said I got to hydrate because I have a lot of thoughts on BLM. BLM was one of those things that exposed a few things. One, it showed me why, and I don't want to say pastors should stay in their lane, because I definitely do think that the scripture has things to say about social issues. It's just a matter of whether you're interpreting the scripture through a social lens or you're interpreting social issues through a biblical lens. So when a pastor says, like, when he has to go to a Marxist organization, right? 2 of the 3 co-founders says we're trained Marxists. 2 of the 3 identify as lesbians or LGBTQ. Since 2015, they were saying then that queerness is at the forefront of BLM. On their website, 13 original principles, queer affirming, trans affirming, woman affirming, their Black villages and Black families principles had nothing to do with the nuclear family. They started out the Black villages principle by saying, we commit to disrupting the Western prescribed nuclear family.
Yep, I remember.
So all these pastors, I'm not saying you got to go and read Gramsci and any of the Columbia School or, you don't have to do any deep research. Just go to blacklivesmatter.org. They could have done that anytime between 2015 to 2020 to see what these women believe, to understand their worldview. Because as a person who believes in the book and who believes that my identity is in Christ and who believes that I'm created with dignity and value because of my creator, not because of the color of my skin, I don't have to go to people who hate God to get them to affirm the value of my life.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I remember having this conversation with Sho Baraka. I don't know if you know who Sho Baraka is, but he's somebody that helped start the AND project, the AND campaign.
Do we have time to talk about them too?
If you want to. but from my understanding, in response to not wanting to fool with the Black Lives Matter organization, in response to their removing all these things. And so everything you just said to me, he hit me to that in 2014, 2015, when we were doing a show in Atlanta and was like, yeah, man, that's not it. You know what I mean? And then even in his book, he talks about how if you look at the news, you would think that black people want to abolish police and defund the police. When you look at the statistics, black people want more police. People in these neighborhoods want more police. So Sho's also been, I feel like, fairly balanced on these things to some degree. I think the question I would ask is, this is how I've seen the issue, and you could push back. You could push back on it. I think a lot of stuff got backdoored. I think a lot of stuff got backdoored with regards to a specific issue of there's a lack of responsibility and accountability with certain police officers.
Of course.
And then what got backdoored is all police officers have implicit bias against black people.
Right.
Oh, and by the way, we need to overthrow police. Oh, and by the way, we need to disrupt capitalism. Oh, and by the way, we need to trans lives matters. A bunch of stuff got backdoored, where if we look at the foundational issue of like, are there police officers that misbehave and aren't held accountable because of how police unions are set up, which by the way, I find it very ironic that the people the most against unions are okay with police unions having all this bureaucracy and all this protection, right? And so like body cameras, 8 can't wait, banning certain chokeholds. Like these are all reasonable policies. And a lot of my friends in law enforcement are like, yeah, give us body cameras. And that protects us and them.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And so I think like there was an issue. Now, again, we can get into the weeds of whether Michael Brown and all that, right? And what really happened there. But there seems to have been an issue that impacted black and white people that came into contact with law enforcement. And then it got hijacked and a bunch of other stuff got backdoored.
So a few things. One, and I should have started this when I was speaking before, I think it's very important to define terms. I'm a type of person, because I write a lot, and I try not to use euphemisms.
Sure.
So for instance, you'll never see me write mass incarceration unless I'm putting quotations around it.
Sure.
To me, it's a made up term that doesn't actually describe anything, because mass is a characterization of something. So if you say we have mass incarceration, then I would ask, well, what level of decarceration would we need in order to get to just regular incarceration?
Sure.
And the other reason I don't use euphemisms is because they hide a lot of junk.
Okay.
So for instance, when people think mass incarceration, most people think that the prisons are full with nonviolent drug offenders.
Yeah.
And the truth of the matter is that in state prisons, it's a large carceral ecosystem. There are local jails, state prisons, federal prison. Federal prison is fairly small, right? If there's 2 million people under supervision at any given time, about 1.2 are in, so over half would be in state prison. About 700,000 in
federal.
No, in jails.
Oh, jails, the local jails.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Federal is small, like call it 220, 225, somewhere around there.
Okay.
In state prison, there's a higher percentage of white offenders behind bars for drug crimes than black ones.
Per capita?
Just the percent. I'm not doing per capita. I'm just.
Okay.
If there are 100 white guys in prison,
there's 100 guys in prison.
Correct. If there's 100 white guys, 100 black guys, 100 Hispanic guys, about 13% of those white guys are there for drugs.
Got you.
About 12% of the black guys are there for drugs.
Okay.
Now that's completely different than what you get in a narrative.
Okay.
Most people would say it's probably 70, 80%.
Yeah,
but violent crime is what drives incarceration rates.
Got you.
And you see that across the board, and that ties into. So, for instance, homicide is a leading cause of death for young black males, particularly between
preventable.
Correct, between 15 and 24 years old. It's about 50%. CDC, the way they do their leading cause of death, they go in larger categories like 1 to 19 and then 20 to 44. But when you dig into the data and you go between 15 and 24, like truly young men, it's about 50% of black men who die by homicide.
Sheesh.
It's the leading cause of death for young black men and the second leading cause of incarceration. So if anybody comes to me with Black Lives Matter and they're not talking about that issue, I don't even listen to them, because I understand that they're not really about addressing the issue that's most prevalent. They're about prosecuting a case against what they would characterize as systemic racism and white supremacy. And going to the policing issue, right? And look, there's not a criticism you could come up with of the police that I wouldn't say, oh yeah, no, I've heard that, I've seen that. I grew up in New York in the 90s. Amadou Diallo, Abner Louima. The first time I actually drove on the highway with my dad, we ended up in the middle of a riot during the funeral procession for a guy named Patrick Dorismond, who was killed during like an undercover drug thing in the 90s, 99. Giuliani opened up his juvenile record, which people they typically didn't do. We wanted to paint him as a bad guy. And we ended up at a bowling alley right by where he was being buried, and there was a riot that broke out. So I remember that, right? So I'm it's not that I don't think police have issues. My problem with how we talk about them is that we racialize issues. We make race sort of we think race is what links these issues together. But 45% of fatal police shootings are white men. If you had to ask the average American, even somebody who's like in these issues, to name 5 white men who've been shot and killed by the police over the last 15 years,
won't know.
They couldn't do it.
Yeah.
They could not do it.
Yep.
So part of the issue is media focus. And the media, if you were a Martian, you came to this country, to this world, you'd think only black men get shot by the police and only white girls go missing. So part of it is the framing. But to me, it's much more productive to talk about the misconduct of police officers than to try to assume we know what their motives are.
Yeah, well, that's because that's the appeal to motive fallacy. Right. Whenever you tell white people they're all racist, right? You think you know their intent and what's really at the heart and what their motive is. All police officers, all white people, everyone. You don't know. You don't know what's going on. Right. And it's something. There's folks that are ignorant and maybe they inappropriately ask your kids if they can touch their hair. Right. That's different than like you see black people as inferior. And part of the problem is that it leaves when we think race first. One, oftentimes the facts and evidence don't line up with that. Keith Ellison, who's the attorney general in Minnesota, basically towards the end of Derek Chauvin's case said, we had no evidence that race played a factor in this particular incident. And I thought to myself, well, it'd been nice if you had said that on the front end, right? So one, we don't have that evidence. Michael Brown, same thing. I read the DOJ report, right? And they couldn't find a single witness whose testimony was consistent across interviews and consistent with the forensic evidence. Not one. Yeah. But that's not the narrative. Sure. But here's the other problem. It's that people think that you can racialize bad behavior, let's say by the police, when black people are victims. But then you want to de-racialize bad behavior when black folks are perpetrators. And you have to pick one, right? If you want to inject race into a conversation in policing, when you could just say, look, bad police are bad police. The guys who killed Tyree Nichols, the 5 black police officers who killed him, are going to be held accountable by the law. His skin color nor their skin color should play into it. But if you say if you're like Van Jones and you say, oh well, even in this, white supremacy was at play. Sure.
You can't inject race into these types of conversations and then think you can control when other people bring race into it. And as somebody who, even if I don't follow these accounts on Twitter, I see how this is playing out with even some colorblind conservatives, because crime stats are like Visine for colorblind conservatives. Then they can see color. Then they're like, oh, look at the black perpetrator. And I don't like that for a number of reasons. One, because I don't like grouping people I don't like attributing to an entire ethnic group the worst behavior of its members. But I also know that all that does is lead to more tribalism, more balkanization. And then the other thing is, like, honestly, and this goes back to the scripture, no one can stand in their own righteousness.
That's right.
Because I have the stats on child sex exploitation crimes, right? And white men way over index, particularly on, like, child sexual abuse material, like 87, 89%. So I only bring that up to say, like, I don't think it's a good idea to constantly be picking at the racial scabs.
Yeah, well, I think, again, I'm totally with you. And I think whether that's generalizing all police officers is this,
right?
Generalizing all white people is this, or the flip side is generalizing all black people as more violent,
correct,
or more combative, or whatever, right? Where I think, and you can push back on this if you want, I think the variable in terms of the type of folks that come into contact with law enforcement, there's usually a correlation between subcultures within the culture, like black people are, according to the statistics, more likely to be in poverty, right? But white people in poverty also go to jail. White people in poverty also come into contact with law enforcement. White people in poverty also have kids out of wedlock. White people, right? So it sounds like and by the way, this is not segueing into like we need to go socialist, right? That's because that's not what I'm saying either. But it seems like the correlation is that the generalization becomes sometimes that this entire community is corrupt. All police officers are this way. All black people are this way. When the reality is there are pockets within certain cultures that are messed up and need redemption, right? And whether that's white dudes who are looking at kitty stuff that's whack, or committing these types of school shootings, you know what I mean? Or whether it's violent crime in the south side of Chicago, right? It seems like there's specific aspects, not of the entire culture, but of micro tribes within the culture that are messed up, that glorify the wrong things. You know what I mean?
So here's where I agree with you in general, in your general sentiment. So I'll say this just as a general statement: there's neither vice nor virtue inherent in any particular ethnic group.
Amen.
Right?
Amen.
So it's, as a believer, I think sin before I think skin. So I don't subscribe to, attributing sort of our fallen humanity to a person's skin color. There was a scientist named Samuel Cartwright who came up with the term drapetomania in the 1800s. He used that to describe the disorder that Africans had that made them want to seek their freedom. So, I mean, he's obviously a racial pseudoscientist, but to him, a black man who wanted to be free and to have his own family and his own land and his own money was exhibiting some sort of mental health disorder. I think of the same thing when Robin DiAngelo shows up and said, oh, white people, you're fragile if you don't allow me to guilt trip you for the things that other white people did 150 years ago. All racial pseudoscientific nonsense. Sure.
And to be clear, Robin DiAngelo was poison.
Oh yeah.
Kim needs poison. Yeah. I don't know if the Christians engaging with this stuff are pulling from DiAngelo like that. Like, I think my friends that tend to be a bit more of the systemic racism is an issue, we should deal with it. I don't know if they're pulling from the Kimdys and the Robin DiAngelos like that.
I mean, they've definitely pulled from Kendi. I mean, Jamar Tisby's relationship with Ibram Kendi, I think, is fairly well known, and a lot of his stuff came, into the church through that relationship. So again, people can disagree on systemic issues. Like, so for instance, like I'm very much against stop and frisk, for good reason, because if you have a dragnet, if you're trying to catch one guy and you got to stop 100 guys to do that, that to me is not good public policy.
What's funny is when me and Preston Perry were having this exact same conversation, and we were talking about systemic racism, we had this conversation and we were talking about it offline, and that was one of the things he brought up. It was like, I think stop and frisk is a bad policy that negatively impacts black people.
Right, but my So here's where I make a distinction. My feelings about good or bad policy are almost never determined by who is impacted most.
Okay.
So I don't take a disproportionate analysis.
Sure.
Because then the unspoken reality is, if I say, oh, I'm against policy X because it has a disproportionate impact on black people. Okay, well, if it had a disproportionate impact on white people, would you be for it? And if I say yes, then again, I'm showing partiality.
Sure.
So again, I think go to the systemic piece. One, a lot of people don't define their terms, and I found when you actually force them to define their terms, then the analysis starts to break down. Right.
So how would you define systemic?
I would define systemic as anything that's inscribed in law, that's prescribed by policy, and to a slightly lesser extent, sort of normalized through social custom.
Okay.
Right.
So I think based on your definition, outside of, you could argue stop and frisk, you could argue 100-to-1 crack to coke disparity, which was reduced to 18-to-1, I think in 2012. There's not any current laws that someone can point to and say this law is systemically racist. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's probably fair. I'm probably missing something. I mean, even the crack cocaine disparities, I wouldn't necessarily group it in that. Because again, just because something has a disproportionate effect does not sort of...
It doesn't mean that it was intentionally racist, but it does mean that it could have impacts that are hurtful to,
but
you know what I mean?
Here's the interesting thing is that, now I'm just going to go broader, more secular, not just the church. But the people who speak most about systemic racism pull up short when it comes to abortion. Because 40% of abortions in America are sought by black women. And in New York City in 2016, there were basically equal numbers of abortions, induced abortions and live births, about 22,000 each.
From black women?
That's just black women.
Just black women.
Correct.
That's crazy.
Correct.
The same number.
About
babies birth, babies deleted.
Correct.
Wow.
22,000.
Yeah.
So there's no rush to cancel Planned Parenthood. Nobody's talking about the disproportionate impact on black bodies. They're not saying any of that stuff. So they pick and choose when they want to do a proportional analysis. But so again, when it comes to these issues, particularly on race, my thing is I try to follow a similar process. I want the evidence. If you make a claim, first, if you use a term, I'll just kindly ask you to define it.
Sure.
Right? Biblical definitions are even better. So if I'm talking racism, what am I talking about?
Partiality.
Ethnic partiality, ethnic hatred, ethnic vainglory. Okay, I could track with you with that. But if you hit me with power and privilege nonsense, I'll give you an example of how quickly those things fold under just the slightest bit of pressure. You say black people can't be racist because we may have prejudice, but we don't have power. And I say, okay, the police chief of city X is black. He wants more black folks in positions of authority. So he fires somebody, his junior, lieutenant, to hire a black person for that specific reason. The other guy was white, new guy's black. Is that systemic racism? Or if I really want to, tweak the nose a little bit, I'll say, okay, black police chief, he gets rid of a white recruit, right? Or he reprimands a white recruit. The recruit, under his breath, calls the police chief a racial epithet, whatever your favorite one of choice is. And the police chief then fires him, right? And he's heard saying, I gotta get these white boys out of the the PD. We need to put some more melanin in the PD. Who, if anyone, in that situation is acting in a racist manner? The recruit has no power. He literally, he's got fired by a black man. So when people engage in this type of analysis, one of the things that they do that they don't realize is that they encourage a sense of feigned helplessness and powerlessness among black folk. Because 1 minute is, black girl magic, I am the table, you know, I'm walking in power and all this other stuff. And then the next minute, oh, I have no power. Now, you know, you have black mayors, not as many governors, but you definitely got a ton of black mayors, police chiefs, school superintendents, people who have power to set and implement policy. I've even heard black folks say, after having Obama in office, man, Obama had no real power. Now, anything that happened before that, presidents have power. Presidents got a lot of power. Most powerful man in the world until Obama got in. This Obama got no power. The people controlling Obama are the ones with the power. So the race stuff, and I'm most passionate about it when it comes to the church, because I see how quickly it can divide the body. And I'm not against having difficult conversations, but they have to be conversations. Because as husbands, you and I know the difference between, like, we want to have a conversation and we need to talk. And one spouse, I'm not gonna say which one it typically is, wants you to just sit there and say, yes. That's not a conversation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If both people don't have the capacity to be made to feel uncomfortable and to say what it is they actually think, then you're not having a real conversation. So I would welcome conversations on race, but the church, to me, is not really ready to have them. And a big part of it is because 45% of the conversations that Christians have about race are either about one group trying to make another group feel guilty, or the other group trying to assuage themselves of that guilt. And I actually say many of our race issues are the result of a symbiotic relationship between black liberals seeking empathy for injustices that they didn't actually endure, and white liberals seeking absolution for sins that they actually didn't commit. And those two groups have a parasitic relationship on the rest of society. So George Floyd dies, right? George Floyd's killed, right? Derek Chauvin, however you want to interpret all the facts, the knee, toxicology report, whatever. George Floyd dies. Immediate conversation. George Floyd, you know, Police Reform Act. Okay, that makes sense. Goes away quickly. Now here you get the rise of Robin DiAngelo. It's funny because for a while she was like New York Times bestseller, and I think the market understood we can't have a white woman eating off of this black man's body. So then Kendi came up, right? And DiAngelo came down a little bit. DiAngelo comes out. Aunt Jemima had to go away, and all sorts of these other initiatives. And by the time you get to 2021, you have companies saying, USA Today put out a tweet, it was last year. They said in the wake of George Floyd's death, companies were making pledges basically to diversify their ranks. And they haven't done so. And the people who've lost out the most are black women. And when I look at that headline, I said to myself, there are people who think that because this man died on the street in Minneapolis, that they are entitled to a cushy job in a corner office. And they are feeding off of his carcass. And the people who are hiring are saying, this is a protection racket. Because a lot of the BLM stuff, when you go to places, you know, it may be like this here, it's certainly like this in DC. BLM welcome here, and the LGBT flag. I said, this is like blood over the doorpost. They want the death angel to pass over. So they say, no, I'm a good person. I'm one of the good whites. I'm not one of the bad whites. And I just, that's the type of culture vulturism that I cannot get down with, right? And I would hope that if something tragic happened to me, that people wouldn't pick over my carcass and say, because something happened to Delano, I should be rewarded for that. And that's one of my problems with BLM, because that's what they do. And the fact that the organization was started, two of the women are avowed lesbians. And I only bring that up to say their personal choices and their professed beliefs point to the same conclusion to me, that the only value that they see in black men is for one of three things: their seed to create life, their votes for political power, and their corpses to fuel activism. They have no interest in promoting black men as husbands and fathers, only for what they can get from them.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean,
You know, at least that's how their actions would appear on the surface.
I mean,
I don't know their
Yes.
motives. That's what I'm saying.
No.
I don't know.
I said by their public profession.
by the profession, yeah.
Right, and their personal life.
Yeah.
They have, no interest in me as a husband and a father.
Yeah.
Only for what I can offer them, in terms of if something bad was to happen to me.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say, because I don't know where we are on time. I'm willing to go into overtime if it's cool with you.
That's fine.
I want to address something because you talked about culture and microculture. And I want to address something directly. And it relates to music, hip hop culture, and violence. Because I've written about this a fair amount over the last 10, 15 years. I'm gonna start top line. One, I think it's impossible to believe that you could pump certain messages into a specific community and that they would have no effect at all. And anybody who's under the age of 40 has lived their entire life in a culture saturated by hip hop. Now I know what the primary response is going to be. Well, 70% of white people, buy hip hop. Now, I don't even know if that's the case. Maybe that was the case when they were still pressing vinyl.
Sure.
Who knows with streaming? But let's assume it's the case. Well, there's a difference between enjoying music as art and living music as lifestyle. And our culture actually has terms for white guys who we think are engaging in a particular type of black aesthetic. Wannabes, Weegros, Wiggers, Wankster, whatever. We got terms for that. But a black teen who's engaging in the same type of behavior is seen as being authentic. No one ever questions a black man's authenticity if he's on wax talking about shoot, kill, murder, BH, so on and so, lean, Molly, so on and so on and so forth. Never. So one of my issues is that I actually do see a connection between the culture, particularly today, particularly with the advent of drill music, which is basically just guys confessing the crimes.
I mean, drill music is like purely satanic and demonic. It's dark.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but it's not just on the violent side. When I see people like Suki Hana and Sexy Red and Meg Thee Stallion and Cardi B, right, who actually one will sort of tail on the other. I first heard of Cardi B through Love and Hip Hop when it was my guilty pleasure. I first heard of Suki Hana through WAP, the music video. I first heard of Sexy Red through Suki Hana, right?
By the way, I have no idea who Suki Hana is.
Good.
And I've never heard WAP.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
That's a good thing.
I just heard Ben Shapiro did a video
Right.
on it. That's
It
one
was-
song
it was
I already
fun.
know what the song is, and I have
Right.
zero desire to engage in it.
So I only bring it up because, again, you can't say representation matters and kids want to be what they see only when you want to cultivate more doctors, engineers, and lawyers. If it matters, it has to matter across the board. So when kids see, and I mean, black men have been saying this for generations. Like I grew up in a time where the only guys who we saw that were successful, either ballers or the artists, right?
Yeah.
So this is where I wanted to be. And now you have a generation of young women who are emulating that type of behavior where everything is about their sexuality. And they push that out into the culture. Now, my thing is this. I think the black community has one or two choices, including black Christians. Well, let me start with black Christians. We can say, I'm going to hold fast to my Bible, regardless of what it costs me in the culture, regardless of what people call me, what names they want to say, sell out, coon, Tom, whatever.
Yeah.
Or I can hold to my black card. And that black card includes co-signing all of the degeneracy and the self-destruction, as well as pride stuff, abortion, and other values and principles that are directly in contradiction to the scripture.
Yeah.
So that's the choice. But black community, more broadly speaking, the decision is this. Do we want to be collective in nature? And we can be. I remember after Obama was elected, being on the train that next morning, And you see everybody, they got the head nod, and they got the paper, they got the picture of Obama. It was a feeling of sort of collective joy. Now, 2016 was a different type of feeling, right? So we could say, look, we use the term we because we move as a unit, imperfectly, but we represent one another.
Sure.
But if this is what's representing us, if Snoop Dogg showing up to the VMAs in 2005 with 2 women on dog collars is representing us, and you sow that into the ground for generations, you can't sow Snoop and reap Cosby Show. It's impossible. And that's why one of my passions is talking about restoring marriage as the cornerstone of Black family life. And one of the things that has to happen in order to do that is some real honest conversations about the culture. And I would love for more Christian artists to be in those conversations. But I can tell you the disappointment I feel when I hear prominent Christian rappers say something to the effect of, well, my wife is half saint, half city girl.
Oh, man. I gotta, we just had this whole conversation, right?
I'm sure.
Okay. Yeah. No, did you see the Lecrae D1 thing?
I caught a little bit of the back and forth.
Okay.
I didn't see the whole thing.
Okay.
But I saw Lecrae say that on Shade 45 with Sway in the morning.
Yeah.
And it made me cringe.
Yeah.
And I knew what he was going for.
Well, they basically got into a back and forth about righteous and ratchet. D1 said, I'm from New Orleans. We coined ratchet. You can't be righteous and ratchet. That's, and it was anchored on what you said, which is D1, who, as far as I know, is not a conservative, but coming out and saying something to the effect of, when you choose to be more pro-Black than you're pro-God, being pro-Black will have you doing all kinds of foolishness. Crazy stuff. Van Lathan came out and rebuked him and misquoted him, by the way.
Rebuked D1.
Yeah, and intentionally misquoted him. We just had this, we're dropping a clip of it today. But I say all that to say that I think that's happening. Like, I think that's happening by a D1 who's not, as far as I know, maybe I'm wrong, and I don't mean to speak for him, but I don't think he is where you are on the political spectrum.
Yeah,
you know
fine.
what I mean? He's not a where Vadi is. He's not on that end of the spectrum. But that is happening. That is happening. That there is pushback. And in terms of mainstream stuff, I've just always viewed it as this: the Black people in my real life are not how I see Black people in the media.
Agreed. My real life is like that too.
Yeah.
But
and so I hear you on the representation front, but I would just say hip hop culture or drill culture is not synonymous with, I think, the day-to-day experience of the average Black person.
Correct.
Just like country music or whatever genre is not always indicative of what the average white person is going through.
But I'll say this, and I'm glad you said that, because there's a lot of commentary, and I see this more so in the online space, where people will say X, Y, and Z is not Black culture. And X, Y, and Z is almost always a negative thing, right? And my response would be this. One, something does not have to be practiced by 50% plus one of the population for it to be part of the culture.
That's fair.
I would argue that the average American actually does not think that a man can have a baby. But trans ideology is definitely a part of American culture.
Is it though?
Infused from K through 12.
I think it's attempting to be. I don't know if it is. I don't know if we're there yet.
The fact that parents don't have the right in some jurisdictions to opt their kids out tells me that it is.
Maybe.
Right?
Maybe.
And the fact that and this is the way that culture in my estimation that it works is that you don't need 51%. You just need the most influential 5%.
You need the activists. You need the activists that are going to write the policy. I hear you on that.
Correct.
I hear you on that. I would say it like this. Like there is, like, I'm Armenian. Armenia is the first Christian nation. Self-identified. There's debate between them and Ethiopians on who's right. Armenians had the Armenian genocide of 1915. It still won't be recognized by Turkey. Probably never be recognized by Turkey. America just recognized it. Israel still has not recognized, which is very interesting considering Israel, Armenians were the inspiration for the Holocaust, according to Hitler. So there's some degree of systemic issues in terms of folks actually being pushed out of places we've been historically, right? And then there is the immigrants that came here from the same town, and the strong abuse of alcohol to the point where I remember being a child and my mom getting phone calls in the middle of the night, so-and-so just died in a drunk driving accident.
Wow.
The strong connection to a lot of men beating their wives, right? And me seeing my mother get beat as a child. A lot of dysfunction, right? That is not Armenian culture. That is not my people, right?
Which part? The drinking?
The drinking, like the drinking and the abuse to the point where you're going to go and drive yourself off the road, right? Beating your wife is not a part of the culture, right? Those are all dysfunctional aspects of broken people that are influenced by different variables. But I wouldn't say that like Armenians just beat their wife. Armenians are all alcoholics. Right. Like
correct.
I don't think that's a fair assessment, because I think it's a very specific type of person that's dealt with specific issues, like being brought up in communism, coming to a whole new nation, overdoing it on the celebration aspect, and then you lose your life in the process.
So here's how I would. This is my sort of.
You get the parallel though.
No, I do, but when I think, okay, it's such and such, if I'm trying to judge, it's such and such part of a culture, however culture is defined, American culture, black culture, Western culture, whatever. One is prevalence. How prevalent is it? Is it really common or is it extremely rare? But the other one, which is actually much more important to me, is what is the response? And if the response from the average Armenian family to a loved one's excessive drinking is to say, this person needs help or this person is out of here. We're cutting them off. I say I'm with you.
I think generally speaking, there's the same degree of disgust. And just being horrified by some of the deviant behavior as there is from my friends within the black community towards kids in the Bronx getting killed over drill music. Or kids in Florida getting killed. It's the same degree of stop the violence. Right. Let's go out and march for these other issues in these communities. Right. Like I'm watching a documentary on NBA YoungBoy right now, and you see what the mothers are saying, and you see the impact, like beyond that demographic. Would you say 15 to 25? Right. Beyond the demographic. Like the rest of the culture doesn't seem to be like, go drill on the ops. Like that doesn't seem, or even cool with it or tolerate it.
They'll say that honestly, but I don't see it reflected in real life. And I want to be very clear, because oftentimes when people talk about police violence, there's some progressives who say, well, conservatives always want to. So what about Chicago, right? I actually think that's a legitimate question that should be answered.
I don't have no problem. I hear you.
But I will say this, and I say this as somebody who worked in gun violence prevention. Local communities care a lot about violence. I've been at meetings and the grandmothers are asking for more police and they're burying their own children, so they care. But there's a chasm between what is covered locally and what is given airtime nationally.
But don't you think that what's national is going to be whatever feeds the algorithms, lust of the eyes, lust of the fresh, pride of life? Like
to some extent,
I think most of the things that are going to go in the algorithms, if it bleeds, it leads. If it leads, it bleeds. The news, I think most of those things are going to be more darker, debaucherous things. The news don't really deliver good news to us.
No, but what I'm saying is they're selective even on the darkness. So, for instance, this around the same time that Jacob Blake got shot in Kenosha, right? 20 people got shot at a house party in D.C. I think only one person passed away. 20 people were shot. The Washington Nationals canceled their game against the Philadelphia Phillies sometime in August because of Jacob Blake. They wouldn't even send a tweet out about a shooting that happened 10 minutes from their ballpark.
I hear you.
So the difference, and when I'm giving an assessment of some of the things that I'm seeing in black culture, and again, I'm holding different things in tension. People I know personally, how they respond to things. And even within that, there's a difference between how you respond to things when you and your wife are talking in the house and the types of things you're willing to take a bullhorn out into the street and protest about.
That's fair.
And there's not a place there's not a church, a mosque, an HBCU, an award show, a media company that somebody like Snoop Dogg can't show up and receive love within the black community. There's nowhere that he cannot go and be celebrated. Somebody like, the easy one is Clarence Thomas. But even somebody like Tony Dungy, Hall of Fame NFL coach. You know what I mean? Legend in his own right. Sort of champion the cause of diversity, particularly for black, basically the dean of black coaches. Tony Dungy was likened to a white supremacist by a journalist, a black man named Kevin Blackstone in the Washington Post, because Tony Dungy spoke at the March for Life. So what I'm saying is, somebody like Lil Nas X can go and be recognized by the NAACP. Dwayne Wade and Gabrielle Union won a President's Award from the NAACP because of their support of their daughter, Zaya Wade, right? And what I'm saying is, somebody with Tony Dungy's values, which you and I would probably both say are more reflective of sort of the broader black community's traditional,
I would hope so,
socially conservative values.
I think so.
Definitely for anybody over the age of 60. Under the age of 30, nah.
Yeah, but most folks under the age of 30 are going to be more loose and liberal.
Okay, I'll bump it up to 40.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is this, and this is where it goes back to the culture, because I'm talking about the response. And there's no sort of mainstream black organ of culture, NAACP, BET Awards, The Root, the Griot, that is going to cover Tony Dungy in a fair and balanced manner.
I get what you're saying.
They're not going to give fair treatment to his views that are biblically grounded.
I hear you.
You know
I think you're saying media, and I think that's fair. I think you're saying media and like whatever those avenues are.
I'm talking about media, but I'm talking about the larger black progressive leadership class.
I got you.
These are people I call the Afrostocracy.
No. I think you're totally right. I guess my only question would be like, do those people make up the average person walking day to day?
Assuming they don't, here's what they do. They gatekeep. And they put a cap on the types of things that could be discussed. So if I show up to Derek Johnson's office, the head of the NAACP, he's in West Baltimore, and I said, Mr. Johnson, I want the NAACP to partner with me, Heritage Foundation, whoever, to run a marriage before carriage campaign in the black community. Will you work with us? Let's get the NBA on board. Let's have the NBA run ads in every city in which they do business. First one, LeBron James, him, Savannah, they got the 3 kids, and he's saying, take it from me, guys. Every king needs a queen. I should know. I'm King James. And you slap that on every billboard, bus station. Yeah,
they could be powerful.
If I say, and Derek Johnson says, okay, so we're going to have same-sex couples in here? And I'm going to say, no, like I define marriage as the one man, one woman for one lifetime. He says, sorry, we got to pass.
I got you.
Then they're not doing it.
That's fair.
Nobody in the Congressional Black Caucus is doing it. None of the pundits are going to support it. If it's not LGBT affirming, they're not going to support it. None of the center-left preachers are going to support it. Nor the professors. And the athletes and the entertainers are going to fall right in line. These are the 5 groups. These are the 5 Ps of the Afrostocracy. The black progressive politicians, pundits, professors, preachers, and performers. And what I'm saying is these cultural gatekeepers will not allow anything that has a hint of a biblical worldview to emanate to the broader black community.
Do you think the uprising of independent media, stuff like Breaking Point, stuff like what we're doing now, independent podcast, right? There's a huge movement of black conservatives right now on YouTube, on podcasting. Do you think that could tip the scales? Because again, the people I'm meeting, and maybe a selection bias on my part, right? I think you're talking about the thought leaders, if you will, right? And you're saying they're gatekeeping. I'm saying the stuff that I'm seeing, I have never seen this many black conservatives. I've never seen this many voices. I've never seen so many people that are on a ground level that don't have voices, that are like, man, we ain't with that,
right?
Transformer stuff. Y'all crazy. Like I'm meeting more and more black men that are more overtly pro-life. And so like I guess on a ground level we're seeing, because it's all in. Is culture built top down or bottom up? You know what I mean? Is it
So that's an
grassroots?
excellent question, yeah.
And it's coming from conversations like this and the micro tribes we're all building, or does it have to be top down from some institution that has funding, that's gatekeeping, that's embedded? I feel like there's a shift happening where it's ground up.
I think
in terms of persuasion.
Yes.
In terms of persuasion, and I think where most people are.
One, I would agree with your assessment in terms of the growth of particularly like Black conservative platforms, and some of them not even necessarily conservative. Like I watch a lady, she runs a podcast called Pink Book Lessons, and her target audience, she speaks mainly to Black women, and her thing is all about the family, natural order, structure, two-parent homes, marriage. Have you ever heard of Shahrazad Ali?
Sounds familiar.
Okay, she was in the Nation of Islam. She wrote a book, like The Black Woman's Guide to the Black Man, heavy in the 1990s, was criticized because some of the stuff was like, you know, a little out there. But Pink Book Lessons is like a combination of Shahrazad Ali and like Kevin Samuels, right? I think the popularity of Kevin Samuels tells me that there's an appetite for some an appeal to traditional values, even if not explicitly Christian. But again, within the internal cultural war within Black America, which is raging as we speak, the people you're talking about is like guerrilla warfare, right? The people I'm talking about got the tanks and the bombers. Because for instance, I was thinking about it the other day. I said, like, I know about the Root, right? I'm actually going to the Root Institute in DC next Wednesday. They're going to have Don Lemon and all sorts of people talking about the state of Black America. And I wanted to be there to offer my voice. But I don't know where a Black conservative would go to get news and information from a center-right perspective. There's no Black conservative Root or Griot. There are personalities that have podcasts, but in terms of like infrastructure, media infrastructure, particularly for the written word, it's not there. So my thing is this: I think the gatekeepers are the ones that oftentimes set the agenda. The rise of BLM, the infusion or the rise of BLM, let's say even within the church, evangelicalism, that one bottom up to me. It was top down.
Yeah.
The way that the Black church, not all, but many Black churches embraced or open to and have shifted on same-sex marriage post-Obama. Oh, that was top down.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. I think my question, which kind of coming back to the reference from Uncle Tom, is like, how does persuasion happen? Like, how does persuasion happen? With, in my opinion, one position is, hey, you control the controllables, right? And so we could talk about the systems, we could talk about the media, we could talk about who's influencing what, but at the end of the day, we can control the control. We can talk about no-fault divorce laws, right? How does that message get out and more young people under 40 get a hold of that message when, if I look on the conservative side, there seems to be less nuance than what you exhibit in the way you're willing to engage. It seems to be very dismissive. It seems to be very and a lot of times the leftists just do a better job of storytelling and persuading, it seems like, and infiltrating institutions.
Yeah, they want terms and territory. They want institutions and they want the dictionary. Yeah, and they got both right now.
Yeah, and so it's like, how does that happen on a persuasion level? On a bottom up persuasion level, to say, hey, ultimately, like I said, I don't know what percentage. I don't know. I don't know what that percentage is between nature versus nurture, between systems versus individuals. I don't know. I would like to think that I made a lot of great choices in my life, and God's preserved me in His providence as well. Right. I don't know though. You know what I mean? I think I'm also standing on the shoulder of my mom, who was very intentional, even though my dad wasn't in the picture. And anyway, so. Yeah, how do we persuade? That's my question. Hey, if you want to see the extended version of this podcast, completely unedited, consider partnering with us in our online community for as little as $5 a month. In exchange, you get access to these podcasts as we stream them live before anyone else gets to see them. You get access to the replay of our daily after party streams, access to our private Discord server, access to discount codes, and so much more. So help us continue contextualizing the gospel through media, podcasting, and YouTube. and partner with us for as little as $5 a month. Also, be sure to follow us on the Spotify podcast app, on Facebook, and on Instagram. We're constantly posting content there that I think you'll find extremely valuable. All right? I'll see you over there. Peace. We see according to the Bible that prayer is extremely important in terms of us being transformed from the inside out when we get aligned with God's will. I want you guys to implement these spiritual disciplines in your day-to-day life. And the only way I've been able to do this consistently is through writing down my prayers in a prayer journal that does a few things. One, it allows me to reflect and come to God humbly and ask Him to move on my behalf. And two, it allows me to document my prayers, which ultimately helped me remember the very things that I was praying for and see the hand of God tangibly in my life when He answers them. So I would urge you, consider writing down your prayers. It could be in a blank notebook. It could even be on your phone. Or you could check out the one I personally designed and used from my own quiet time and spiritual discipline that I think would be a huge blessing. It's the exact structure and system that I've used for years to pray and be more consistent in my spiritual disciplines. And here's the thing, with the hope to create a prayer movement, we've made the PDF version of this prayer journal completely free. So to get the PDF of our prayer journal completely for free, go to blessgodpdf.shop